Look, here comes the letter A. It says ah. A is for albatross. Look, here comes the letter B. It says buh. Buh. B is for blue jay.
Look, here comes the letter C. It says k-k. C is for cardinal.
Look, here comes the letter D. It says da-da. D is for duck. Look, here comes the letter E. It says E. E-E. E is for eagle. Here comes the letter F. It says foo. Foo. F is for flamingo. Here comes the letter G. It says g. G is for goose. Look, here comes the letter H. It says huh. Huh. H is for hummingbird.
Look, here comes the letter I. It says I is for ibis. Look, here comes the letter J. It says J. J is for jungle fowl.
Look, here comes the letter K. It says cuckoo. K is for kiwi.
Look, here comes the letter L. It says L. L is for lorikeet. Look, here comes the letter M. It says M. M is for macaw.
Look, here comes the letter N. It says no. N is for newthatch.
Look, here comes the letter O. It says O. O is for owl.
Here comes the letter P. It says poof, poof. P is for penguin. Here comes the letter Q. It says quack, quack. Q is for quail. Here comes the letter R. It says R is for robin.
Look, here comes the letter S. It says sus. S is for swan.
Look, here comes the letter T. It says toof, toof. T is for toucan. Here comes the letter U. It says U is for umbrella bird.
Here comes the letter V. It says V. V is for vulture.
Look, here comes the letter W. It says woo.
W is for woodpecker.
Look, here comes the letter X. It says KS. KS. X is for xenops. Look, here comes the letter Y. It says ya. Y is for yellowbird.
Look, here comes the letter Z. It says Z. Z is for zebra finch.